continuing on here in chapter 6, wrapping up our discussion of proteins. So 6.5 is looking at what proteins do. So why do we need to consume them? What do they do for us? So there are multiple functions of proteins. Again, unlike carbs and our triglycerides that are mainly all about energy, proteins do a lot of different things. And those consume, again, making different body components. So we need them to make other things like muscles, to maintain fluid balance. They help with our acid-base balance that keeps our pH normal. Again, most enzymes are proteins, so we need amino acids from our diet to make the enzymes we need. We have lipid hormones like estrogen, but we also have protein hormones. So we need amino acids to make those. It helps with our immune system, and it actually also helps make glucose, as well as, when needed, can provide energy, but also helps increase that satiety, that feeling of fullness. So again, thinking about these different body structures, so I mentioned muscles because that's mainly what we think about, but I just wanted you to see this other laundry list of all the other body structures that we need proteins to help us make. Even mucus to help get rid of that bacteria and stuff trapped in our lungs, help with blood clotting, transport proteins in the blood, those lipoproteins we talked about last chapter where it helps transport the lipids. Again, all of our enzymes are mainly made up of proteins, so we need those amino acids. Antibodies in our immune system, they're proteins. We have different protein or peptide hormones, so our endocrine system needs them. Different pigments, those visual pigments are needed, or need proteins, and also bone structure. So again, we need lots of proteins because they make so many different things for our body. Now there is a protein turnover, which is just the breakdown and synthesis, because cells have to respond to change. And so to do that, amino acids are recycled. They're not typically just excreted. Instead, we break down one protein like from our diet so we can reuse those amino acids to make something else. So just to kind of put it in perspective, during the day, and adults typically break down and make 250 grams of protein. That's a lot of protein. And we consume about 65 to 100. So we are more than doubling, almost tripling the amount of turnover because, again, we're recycling those amino acids. We don't have to consume 250 grams, even though we're making it, because we can recycle those amino acids. But if that protein intake is too low for an extended amount of period, not just like a day, but multiple days, then that rebuilding and repair, that turnover definitely slows down. And all those things we just mentioned, like muscles and blood and all of that, blood proteins start decreasing in size or volume. Now, as far as maintaining that fluid balance in normal tissue, again, everything, it's not swollen, so our blood pressure is nice and balanced, so we can keep everything moving properly. But what happens in some conditions, we get edema or kind of swollen inflammation. And what happens here is that the blood pressure exceeds the counteracting force of those blood proteins. So fluid stays in the tissue and it doesn't get absorbed back into the blood. So essentially there are too many proteins that are here in the blood. So you can see these different proteins here. So sometimes if we get too many proteins built up in the blood, it leads to that swelling that happens because since there's so many proteins, water can't be reabsorbed from our tissue. So it starts swelling. And of course, this happens in injury because we have a lot of different proteins introduced during an inflammatory response or injury. Now with the acid base, again, thinking about our pH system, so we have protein pumps, and our membranes pumps should indicate active transport. So these are pumping or moving different ions in and out of the cell, and that includes hydrogen ions, which are what control our pH. So without these transport proteins, this active transport, then we don't have a way of transporting protons or hydrogen ions in and out of our cells. And a lot of proteins also can act as a buffer, and that just means there's a resisting to change. So even so if we have a buffer in our stomach, even if we're eating acidic foods like tomatoes or drinking coffee, the proteins that are in the stomach, they can kind of buffer it. So it absorbs some of that extra hydrogen ions that are released. Now, as far as forming hormones and enzymes, so again, it's mainly the amino acids from the proteins we digest. Those get turned over and they're used to make other molecules. So for example, some of the thyroid hormones, they're made up of proteins, and particularly they're made from that amino acid tyrosine. Insulin, we talk a lot about with blood sugar and diabetes. It is a peptide hormone, so it's made up of different amino acids. So we need those amino acids to make that hormone insulin. And again, almost all of the enzymes that are used in digestion, like trypsin and pepsin that we talked about with breaking down proteins, we have thousands of different enzymes, so we need these amino acids to make them. As far as its job in the immune function, so again, proteins are key to the immune system. So without sufficient dietary protein, we lack the material for the body to function properly. Again, antibodies are made up of protein, so we can't defend against or make antibodies against a bacteria if we don't have enough amino acids to do so. So again, that low protein status can turn an infection that normally our body could respond to. It can actually make it fatal because we can't make antibodies to defend against it. So again, keeping those protein levels normal is important for immune health. As far as energy, again, we can use proteins to actually, and some of the amino acids can actually be used to make glucose. So if we don't have enough carbs, or we've already broken down all of our glycogen, but the brain still needs glucose, actually some of the amino acids can be used to make glucose. And that's one of the jobs of the liver. It makes glucose from some of those amino acids. And what happens during starvation, so we think about somebody who may be anorexic, the amino acids from their muscles start breaking down because they're being used to make glucose because they're not eating enough to keep up with their energy demands. And that causes wasting of the muscle tissue because, again, that muscle tissue is broken down to make glucose. It also can cause swelling or edema because, again, now we have all this extra protein in the blood as we're trying to move things around to make glucose. So that can cause that swelling because of too many proteins in the blood. As far as energy goes, again, this is typically not the main function, only little energy, as long as everybody's kind of at a weight stable and we're consuming enough carbs and we have enough fat. But energy can be derived from our proteins. So during prolonged exercise and in different weight loss efforts. So again, not some individuals, if we're dieting, decrease their overall, calorie intake, and that causes proteins then to be burned and broken down to provide energy, which helps with weight loss. However, it is a costly source of calories because the amino group, so remember that nitrogen containing group in amino acids, it has to be removed before we can get energy from it or to make glucose. And then that remaining, what's left is just carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. That's what's broken down to get energy. Well, that ammonia is a waste product. So that's why if we are breaking down a lot of proteins, either to make glucose or whatever reason, the urine typically has a very strong smell. And this is just showing this breakdown of amino acids. So again, the amino acid pool. So it comes from the amino acids in our diet or just from the proteins in our cells being broken down that provides those amino acids. Then those amino acids, again, are used to do multiple things. So they can even make some of our neurotransmitters, the different fats or ketones that are made in there can come from those amino acids. Again, we can use them to make glucose, but that free ammonia that gets made as those are being broken down, again, it goes to the liver and ultimately gets excreted in the urine. But again, energy production from that can lead to that as well. Or just using them to make different body proteins, like, again, our muscles or hormones or enzymes. Then their role in contributing to that feeling of satisfaction. So again, satiety is no longer having the desire to eat. We feel satisfied. So the potential to increase that and to control appetite. So the greater amount of protein that we have in our diet compared to carbs or fats actually promotes that. So again, high protein meals allow us to feel full longer than high carb or high fat. So again, higher proteins are appropriate if we're nutritionally sound. They're moderate in fat. So again, thinking about not consuming a lot of red meat or fatty foods, and that they have that plant sources, so that it has fiber in them. So then we want, we can consume higher proteins, but we don't want to increase our proteins to make us feel fuller longer if we're still adding a bunch of fat or they're not healthy proteins. All right, and then just a nice little summary table here. I'm looking at the different functions of our proteins. So again, as far as regulatory, they're used to maintain the fluid balance, that acid-base or pH system. They make our enzymes or hormones involved in the endocrine system, as well as just digestion and immune health. Contribute directly to immune health by making antibodies. But in addition to that, again, they can also be used to provide energy and make us feel satisfied, and making body components like that hemoglobin or muscles or all that other laundry list, lipoproteins, all of those. So again, lots of functions of our proteins. All right, so then our protein needs here, what are the recommendations? All right, so there needs to be a balance called protein balance or equilibrium. So that's just balancing the intake with protein losses. So again, we talked about that turnover. Our body makes and turns over way more proteins than what we need to consume. So the estimated protein need, the recommended daily allowance is about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of weight. So for example, if a woman weighs 154 pounds, we multiply that by 0.8, and that gives us 56. Now again, we need to do a little math here because we're used to pounds, and this is again kilograms, which is metric. So we need to convert those pounds to kilograms, and then we can use the kilograms multiplied by the 0.8 to see how many grams of protein this woman should be consuming. So again, our protein balance here. So sometimes there are different reasons that we need to have excessive proteins. So we need a positive balance, meaning we take in more than we need. So kids as they're growing, women during pregnancy, recovering from illness or injury, or during athletic training where we're doing a lot of muscle building. Then we want to increase our proteins. Again, balance just means we are consuming or excreting as many as we are taking in. And that's kind of where most healthy individuals need to be. Now, sometimes there is a negative protein balance. So inadequate, if there is inadequate protein intake, so then we're using more proteins than we're consuming. So again, inadequate calorie intake here, so we're not consuming enough, or different conditions like during different infections or different diseases like kidney disease that increase the amount of proteins being released from the kidneys. So that can lead to a negative balance where we're not consuming as many as we need or are excreting. All right, now as far as the calculations, so again, the 0.8 grams of protein per kilocalorie. So now we have that acceptable macronutrient distribution range, so AMDR. So about 10 to 35% of our total calories should come from proteins. So if we do a little math here and base this on a 2,000 kilocalorie, so if we consume at least 10%, then that's, we get, and then also subtract that by how much energy is actually getting released. So there's 4 kilocalories here. We end up with 50 grams is the minimum. And then if we do the same thing, only using 35%, again, looking at that 4 kilocalories because that's the energy release, then it's 175. So for most healthy individuals, we want to consume 10 to 35% of our calories in proteins. For consuming a 2,000 kilocalorie diet, that's anywhere between 50 to 175 grams of protein. So the typical consumption, men typically eat about 100 grams per day and women about 65. So this is an area that typically within the United States, we do pretty good meeting that protein need. So some of the recommendations that are made, again, variety, so that we get all those 9 essential amino acids, getting those from seafood, because that also helps with our omega fatty acids, lean meats, but then also our poultry, eggs, legumes like beans and peas, nuts, seeds, and soy products. So the following shifts are recommended, though, to increase the variety to make more nutrient dense. Again, just meaning getting more protein per calorie. So this can be achieved by the seafoods or beans and peas, so the legumes, more so than eating, again, the red meats or the poultry or eggs. So that can provide more nutrient dense food. All right, so looking at some others, so most consumption of meats and poultry should be from fresh, frozen, or canned, and also lean form, so where that fat's been removed. So things like chicken, turkey are good compared to processed meat. So hot dogs, sausages, ham, lunch meat. We want to stay away from those and use more of the fresh, frozen, or canned. Also, just replacing those high fat meats, again, hot dogs, sausage, and bacon, right along there. Not only do they have a lot of processed protein, but they also have a lot of fat in them as well. So again, seafood helps lower that intake of saturated fatty acid as well as salt, and it has other nutrients that are needed. Our beans, peas, lentils, they have the similar benefit, but that also increases our dietary fiber that helps meet some other needs. All right, so our protein requirements per meal, again, maintain more equal distributions of proteins. So that provides that optimal function of the proteins. So if we consume about 30 grams of protein at one meal, that helps divide the protein up throughout the day to meet that RDA. So that 30 grams helps with positive muscle production, and protein during breakfast has been shown to be especially critical. So I know there are a lot of different diets and stuff like that out there, a lot of different recommendations, but having protein during your breakfast is really key to meeting those protein needs throughout the day. Right now, as we get older in age, that response to protein actually decreases. So even though they may be consuming it, they're not able to eat it or not able to absorb it as well. So that ProTage kind of study group here, there was a recommendation that older individuals increase their intake to more than 1 gram per kilogram instead of the 0.8. So more protein as we age. Again, focusing on the quantity and the timing of the protein, so spacing that out. Again, consuming meals with greater than 20 grams of protein, so spreading that out throughout the day. And then again, having more leucine which helps with skeletal muscle. So consuming more of that essential fatty acid. Now, amino acid supplements, sometimes these are especially used by athletes and weight loss. So the right amount of protein helps with both of those. However, the supplements are not necessarily considered safe. Essentially what it does is it overwhelms the absorptive mechanisms in the small intestine because there's so much packed in there. Essentially the small intestine just can't possibly absorb it all, and it puts it into kind of a stressed environment. So then you have these proteins that aren't being completely broken down because the small intestine can't possibly absorb them all. So now we have excessive amino acids building up that can cause imbalances, and again, those toxicities that we talked about earlier that can affect neurological and other issues. So most likely, though, the most likely ones to cause toxicity, there are 3 amino acids particularly that high levels are dangerous. So methionine, cysteine, and histidine are ones to watch. All right, so a little bit here just about nutrition and genetics, because this is becoming like a pretty big field. So just so you have kind of an introduction to it. So genetic variation directly affects proteins encoded by our genes, and the results are different. So nutrition requirements among individuals are different based on our genetics. So just our metabolism, based on the proteins that we're making, or the amount of proteins, that is based on our DNA. And so that's going to be different for every individual. So again, our recommended daily allowances, that's based on a large population. But again, understanding each person is going to be different. And then the effects of environmental factors, like our diet on our genes, is different. So some people may react, again, think about allergies or things like that. We don't all react the same to everything. So a couple terms here that go along with genetics: epigenome. So this is kind of a network of different compounds that surround the DNA. So it's not our DNA, but these are compounds closely related to our DNA that can modify or change it. They don't actually change the sequence, like they're not mutating it, but they are altering it. And essentially, they're either making genes active or inactivating them. So they're more controlling the activity of the DNA more than the DNA itself. So they're kind of regulating it. Then the term epigenetics. So this is a study of heritable changes in gene function that are not dependent on the sequence. So again, these other chemicals and how they're affecting the activity of the DNA. So there, again, there's not a mutation. We didn't change any nucleotides, but the DNA doesn't function quite the same way as in other people. An example of this would be malnutrition during pregnancy. That has been shown to kind of modify or change the gene expression, which is turning on or turning off DNA in the fetus. And that can actually cause long-term body weight regulation changes in that infant and through adulthood. So again, our diet, for example, can alter the control of our DNA. So some of these emerging fields that are coming relating to genetics and nutrition. So nutritional genomics, just the interaction between nutrition and genetics. So this includes what's called nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. Nutrigenetics is just studying the effects of genes on nutritional health. So again, some may need more or less of a nutrient than others based on their DNA. And then nutrigenomics is how food impacts health by interacting with the genes. So again, nutrigenetics is more the effect of genes on nutrition. Nutrigenomics is more the effect of food on genetics. All right, so just kind of switching them a little bit. All right, so again, nutrigenetics, looking at how our DNA impacts how our food is absorbed or how we react to it. Nutrigenomics is looking at how food impacts our DNA or our genetics. All right, so some of the links that have been shown, so there's definitely a link between genetics and nutrition related to cardiovascular or heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and cancer. And there are genetic tests that are available that look at susceptibility. Again, doesn't always indicate you would get it, but individuals who are more likely to develop a disease based on their genes. So there's different genetic testing that you can undergo, especially if there's a family history of heart disease or obesity. You can have your DNA analyzed to see if you have the same genetics that make you more likely to have these conditions. So that's referred to as your genetic profile. So the genetic tests are available for over 1,000, so about 1,500 different diseases and conditions that they can be tested for. Again, dietary advice is kind of tailored to a personal and cultural preference. Some, depending on whether something can be done with the information, maybe you don't want to know that you're more likely to get cancer. That may cause stress that would then further increase your chances of getting cancer. Whereas something that, knowing your genetics could help you tailor your diet to prevent, to increase your chances of not getting a disease, that may be beneficial. So family history, though, is definitely important. So again, how likely, have you seen this disease in other family members? Then you may want to get tested. If it's not something that's been in there, maybe it's not such a big deal. So again, there's a lot of new research, a lot of things to consider. So there's also a genetic counseling that's out there that looks at the psychology and kind of advising individuals on whether to get tested or what they do with the news once they get it. All right, so now kind of looking at the idea of a vegetarian and plant-based diet. So just a few reasons about why people can decide to become vegetarians. So it may be different ethnic, religion, could be even economic or health reasons for determining that. So this has changed over the centuries from necessity. So there are definitely some individuals who could only eat plants. That's all that they had available. There were no meat based on where they were living. So it has changed from being a necessity to an optional choice. These nutritional needs can be met with a vegetarian diet, so they need to pay a little bit more attention if the vegetarian diet is used, but they can meet all their nutritional needs. Some of the benefits is it does limit saturated fats because those mainly come from animals. Again, also decreases cholesterol because it also comes from animals. It does encourage or encourages high intake of complex carbs. So it helps with that fiber intake, eating more plants, increases our vitamins and minerals as well as that fiber. All right, so it's also been linked to having a positive impact on preventing disease, especially heart health. Again, the lack of cholesterol in the diet, no trans fats, very little saturated fats help with heart health. Also, it has more mono and polyunsaturated fats in the foods that are consumed, especially the beans and the fruits that are there, as well as, again, that good source of fiber, vitamins, minerals, and those phytochemicals. All right, so the planning, though, needs to be considered. So there are a few different options here. Vegan, only eat plant food, so nothing animal-based. Fruitarian, only fruits, nuts, honey, and vegetable oils. Lacto-vegetarians consume plants but also dairy, whereas again, vegan, there would be no dairy because it comes from cows, which is an animal. So it's an animal product. And then there are also lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And this type of diet has the plants, of course, the dairy is included, but then the ovo is the eggs. So eggs are also added or an option in their diet. All right, so again, just kind of looking here. So no animal products would be the vegan diet. So there's also the raw vegan and then the fruitarian. So there are no animal products at all in those individuals. No animal meat is an option in the ovo-vegetarian or the lacto-vegetarian, as well as the one we just mentioned, the lacto-ovo-vegetarian that also adds in the eggs. And then no red meat is another option. So in this case, we have pesco-vegetarian, polo-vegetarian, and polo-pesco. As you can see from the pictures, pesco would just be fish and vegetables. Polo would be the Spanish for chicken. And then polo-pesco would be fish and chicken. So again, lots of varieties, lots of different types of vegetarians. So meal planning is based on those options. So in the vegan diet, again, now we're looking for those complementary proteins. So again, like vegetables and nuts or the legumes, so that all non-essential fatty acids. There are some concerns for using this in infants and children just because of that growth and how many proteins and amino acids are needed, whether that can be maintained by a truly vegan diet. So there are some nutrition or deficiencies, so vitamin B12, iron, zinc, calcium, so eliminating especially all dairy, vitamin D related to that, riboflavin, and then if the fish are eliminated, the omega-3 fatty acids. So again, if it's completely vegan, meaning again, only plants, there are some things to consider. So some supplements can be added to help with this. But again, those are the main concerns with a plant-only diet. So then some food plans for vegetarians based on that are shown here. This is not something that I would, ask on a test or anything like that, but just to kind of give you an idea, especially if you're interested, this just gives some nice alternatives or nice options for meeting those protein needs while planning for or using a vegetarian-based diet.